Welcome to Cyber Leaders with me, Ciaran Martin.
And me, James Lyne. Now, we're both from the Sands Institute who are kindly backing this podcast. I myself am a massive geek and I've spent my life making, basically everything hard for cyber criminals.
And I'm not a techie, although, James, you're the one having technical problems today. I dealt with cybersecurity policy and operations in government and set up the UK's National Cybersecurity Centre. But together, we're trying to unpack the weird, wacky, wired and wireless world of tech security and all the complicated things that it involves.
That's right, Ciaran. This podcast is a voice for security leaders. We want CISO, security directors, and everyone beyond to build up their knowledge, what works, what doesn't, and ultimately secure their organizations more comprehensively and quickly. We'll get into all the gory technical details. Well, maybe we won't do that given I can't make my microphone work, Ciaran.
Well, today is both a challenge and an opportunity, James. A technical challenge for you and an opportunity for us all.
That's an unusually cerebral start from you, Ciaran. Care to explain?
Well, as often on this show, we've been required to, and singularly failed to, exercise discipline and restraint in terms of managing the conversation with our guests. But today is going to be different. No, it isn't. It's going to be even harder than normal. Because with the world being as it is, we have someone we could speak to for hours about managing security and information risks in a really complicated environment. And not just that, he has to enable a genuinely really important mission too, and do digital transformation for that mission. So for him, it's not all just about security. And that speaks to another challenge, James.
So far, I'm hearing a balance towards more challenge than opportunity, but this is very intriguing, Ciaran. So what would the other problem be?
Well, the other problem is we're missing an S, James, the letter S.
An S? Okay, he says wearily. You probably better explain that one as well.
Well, as a Cyber Leaders podcast, and speaking personally on my own behalf as the head of the SANS CISO network, we often have CISOs on, Chief Information Security Officers, CISOs, 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 however you want to pronounce it. Pronunciations vary.
So we're missing an S from the CISO today, are we?
We are indeed. So that's the point. We're joined for the first time on this podcast by a Chief Information Officer. You know, the one who has to worry not just about security, but the whole thing. The information capabilities, the digital transformation journey for the whole organization. And it's not just any organization, James.
Ooh, okay. What is it?
It's a 4-letter acronym.
Oh, I love a 4-letter acronym, particularly if it's a UFLA. The unnecessary 4-letter acronym is my favorite.
I'm afraid it's necessary.
Well, I'll come up with a new acronym for that. But anyway, look, if it's an acronym, you'd better spell it out because you're the one who's always banging on about us needing to make stuff accessible to the general audience. Ones who aren't specializing in cybersecurity, the ones who just have a general interest in the subject, the ones listening because of the court-ordered community service stipulations, etc.
Well, for all these people, normally I would explain. But with this CIO, our guest today, we don't have to explain the acronym for where he works because it's genuinely one of the most important organizations in the world, especially right now.
I feel the need to do a drum roll of some description, but go on, Ciaran.
It's NATO, James, the actual NATO. For balance, l'OTAN, to give it its other official acronym in French, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. I'm guessing you've heard of it?
I have, and you've got to admit, it does sound cool in French, doesn't it?
It does.
What a privilege to talk to the CIO of NATO. Amazing guest, Ciaran.
It absolutely is, and I'm absolutely delighted to welcome, joining us from Brussels, the Chief Information Officer of NATO, Manfred Boudreaux-Dehmer. Welcome, Manfred.
Thank you so much. Ciaran and James, this was an awesome introduction. I have a pretty good feeling that we'll have fun together today. So glad to be on this program.
Wonderful. Hey, thank you so much for being here. I'm sure you've got some wonderful insights to share from an incredibly important organization with some pretty unique challenges, but I suspect many like other organizations too. So, okay, Manfred, look, we're going to dive straight in because otherwise Ciaran and I are going to fail at the first hurdle to get on with time management and discipline. So thank you so much for coming onto our show. A real privilege to have you. Now, I've looked at your bio. You've had an extraordinary career in technology, in cybersecurity, and making tech work for huge organizations. You've been at NATO for getting on for 4 years. But before that, you spent 11 years in Vancouver, lovely part of the world, running all things tech for Sierra Wireless. Before that, you were at Hewlett-Packard. Before that, you oversaw supply chain systems for Compaq in the Americas in both Texas and Brazil. So even though you're geographically closer to home now, you've come a very long way from your first jobs as a programmer in a small town in your native Bavaria in southern Germany, another lovely place. So how did you get into technology and cybersecurity in the first place? And after this extraordinary career in the private sector, what took you to NATO?
Well, really interesting questions. So there are three questions in that one. So the first one is what got me into technology. And so I worked for this Bavarian company as a programmer. And I've chosen programming because the nicest people were in the IT department. And it was also really interesting because they had big machines and printers and big tape drives. And that tells you about how long ago this was. This was in the 80s. And so I kind of got into technology by accident because it was the most interesting place. And then I really liked it and I continued in it. And so your second question was, how did I get into cybersecurity? And that's an equally almost accidental story. So I ran the IT department for Sierra Wireless in Vancouver, as you mentioned. And I started there in 2010. And shortly thereafter was about the time when we took cybersecurity seriously at the company. And so as the head of IT, I built up the cybersecurity program there and found it really, really interesting because it is not just a technical subject. Cybersecurity is a people, process, and technology subject. And that's how I became really interested in cybersecurity. And then the third question that you had, James, was how did I come to NATO? So I was for 11 years in Vancouver with Sierra Wireless, as I said. And it was after 11 years, and it was lots and lots of acquisitions that we did. So lots of integration work, really fun stuff for an IT guy. We also did 2 divestitures of non-strategic parts of our business, which is interesting from acquisitions because everything is in reverse gear and you need to disentangle the systems from your system landscape and then make sure that the entity that you're giving this to is really an entity that can live with this new system going forward. So after 11 years, I knew it was time to do something else. And I found NATO kind of by accident, the job advertisement, and I applied. And a year later, I walked through the doors of NATO.
I love it. Hey, I'm curious. So we all have these moments in our career, sometimes multiple if you're lucky, where you fall in love with something. I remember in cybersecurity, for me, that first moment of a first basic exploit where I'm like, oh, you can trick computers into doing things they shouldn't if you package up code the right way and kind of manipulate what was intended. And I had this like big smile on my face that us nerds will call it the first you've got shell moment. Did you have a moment like that with cybersecurity? Was it a first project, perhaps? Was it a kind of moment, some cool business outcome happened? Or, have you just kind of luckily fallen into these amazing rules by delivering consistently? Maybe you're that mundane, but brilliant.
Oh, boy. My moment when I realized the power of cybersecurity, I think it was must have been 15 years ago by now, when the Stuxnet thing came up and the centrifuges in Iran started spinning out of control.
Oh, that was amazing.
Based on actions, that were taken by the US. And so the fact that you could impact the physical world through the world of cyber, that was a very unusual moment. I do remember reading that story and thought, you've got to be kidding. How can this work? So that was an aha moment. And really have to knock on wood. There isn't like a particular fight in cybersecurity or things, where I came out of and said, oh my God, this was like a major thing. So I need to knock on wood. But what I love about cyber is, as I said in the beginning, it has a people aspect and it has a policy aspect, processes, as well as technology. So it's completely diverse as a field. You can get very deep into technology very quickly, but you can also talk about the most important part of cyber, which is the people defense part in cybersecurity. And there is a lot of people aspects in cyber as well.
Well, let's get to the people aspect via potentially a circuitous route to talk about the organization. I'm pretty sure that all of our listeners know what NATO is, or at least they think they know what NATO is. But I doubt that many people have given that much thought about what it's like to work there or how NATO works. So you've got, I think, 32 member countries now.
Yes.
It's been a bit fluid recently. And it's a military alliance. You're very senior in it. You're a civilian. It has a military commander. It's got a civilian secretary general, normally a very distinguished politician. And I thought I'd ask you this question because when I first encountered NATO when I was in the British government, I asked my old boss, and he used to be the UK's ambassador to NATO. I said, how does this NATO place work? And he said to me, have you ever worked with the EU? I said, yeah, a bit. He said, forget everything you know about the EU and learn it all afresh. There is no organization in the world quite like NATO. So as a place to work, what's it like?
Those are very wise words, by the way. So as a place to work, so we're, of course, political and military alliance. And it's interesting because we do have, you mentioned the Secretary General, and Mark Rutte joined in October of last year.
Yeah, former Dutch Prime Minister, long serving, yeah.
Absolutely. And then we've got SACEUR, the Supreme Allied Commander Europe, but we have one more top military guy who is alongside SACEUR looking after the transformation part of the military, and that is SACT, the Supreme Allied Commander Transformation. So it's an interesting governance construct because you would have these three senior leaders reporting to the North Atlantic Council, the NAC, that is the highest governance body for NATO with the 32 member nations, the ambassadors being in there. And then we've got a number of subcommittees underneath, whether it is resource committees or a cyber defense committee, IT-related committees, and so on and so forth, that are shaping what we do at NATO. So one of the things that makes it a bit challenging at times is that NATO operates at a consensus principle.
Yeah.
So we're not the United Nations where you've got yes votes and no votes and abstentions. We have 32 that need to agree. So if 31 agree and one says no, it is a no.
Okay.
And you have to keep working at it until you reach a yes across all 32. Now, it sounds lengthy and complicated, and it can be. And that's one thing that I had to learn coming in, that you don't get to a decision as quickly as you get to a decision in the private industry. But it also is very powerful because a NATO decision is a NATO decision. And in what we do, which is deterrence and defense, you need to have that. You can't say, well, most of the alliance agrees and wants to do that. You really need to have one voice and all 32 saying yes. So it's a complicated thing, the consensus principle, but it is absolutely worth it. And that's one of the major differentiators, really, of working at NATO. It's not like any other place, especially not in the private industry, where you have a CEO and then you have maybe a board of directors that sets strategy and kind of gives you a financial budget and then has a fiduciary responsibility. It's a very different model.
Absolutely fascinating, because one of the recurring themes on this podcast is people talking about how to get the buy-in of senior leaders, and we've never quite had an answer like that. So, James.
I love this consensus project, but I assume that when it comes down to the difficult decisions, pizza parties are the ideal strategy. Just on your job, Manfred. So as I understand it, you're NATO's first CIO. So obviously you came in from the outside, you didn't decide to establish the job. But why do you think NATO decided to create the post? And kind of what are the main responsibilities that you carry? And perhaps in how they may be different from our standard thinking on a CIO, if one could think in a standard way about a CIO across the world's different types of organizations.
Yeah, let me start with the latter question first. So what is it that I do? So I have two mandates, two parts of a mandate, and one is IT coherence. So NATO, very soon, we will celebrate our 76th anniversary. And like any other venerable older organization that has grown very organically in a federated way, in a decentralized way, we have a very colorful system landscape, right? There's, of course, a lot of legacy systems that come with that as you grow in a bit of a uncoordinated fashion. So one thing that I do is ensure IT coherence across the NATO enterprise. And so, first of all, when I talk about the NATO enterprise, it's the inner part of NATO, the bi-strategic commands, the headquarters, different agencies, schools, other things that we have at NATO that is surrounded by the alliance, which would be the 32 nations. So my view is towards the inside part of NATO to make that cohesive and coherent in the approach to IT. And that has very practical things such as enterprise architecture, portfolio management, service level delivery, technology choices that I look after. The second part of my mandate is cybersecurity, and that's where a little bit of the S comes in that you have talked about that's missing in the beginning. So I actually do have an S in my title. It's the single point of authority for cybersecurity, as we say at NATO, and that is a CISO-like function, even though we don't call it CISO.
So you're saying it's a silent S?
It is a silent S. It's the SPA, yes, single point of authority. So I have that as my mandate. And then the other part of the question was, why now? Why did NATO decide that? So I think it became apparent after quite some time that there is a lot of value in bringing things together, in harmonizing the approach to IT. And the idea came up probably around 2017, 18, and then it took NATO a couple of years to get consensus to creating that position. And it was created in 2020, and then I started in 2021. So it then followed relatively quickly.
I have to say, you're doing a great job. Unlike many public officials I've worked with in the past, must be your private sector experience of answering the questions directly and fully. I don't know how you survive it in bureaucracy.
That is a lost art, isn't it, Ciaran? A lost art.
And you've even found our missing letter. So look, we'll almost certainly come back, unless we completely are undisciplined with time, to your first mandate. But let me ask you a little bit about your second mandate, the cybersecurity mandate, your single point of authority. After all, this is a podcast for cybersecurity leaders.
Yes.
I'd be fascinated to know what you worry about. We try to help people think about what risks there are out there that are specific to their organization so they can prioritize them. And you'll have a standard set of cyber threats because you're the CIO and effectively the CISO for a very large organization. But you're NATO. You're a very high-risk organization. So back in the UK government, we had a certain number of public institutions and we called them the High Threat Club. And if you were British, you'd be at the top of the list. So how do you manage that interface with 32 different countries in a volatile threat environment? And what is it that you most worry about from a cybersecurity perspective?
So when we look at threats for NATO, we have, to a large degree, there's always the four usual suspects, and that's Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran, that we get a lot of activity from these places, and that's not a surprise. The worry that I have, they're very much tied to what's happening in the political landscape. So our geopolitical situation has a direct impact on threats. And that's one thing that we cannot control. We can only control our response to those threats. We measure risk very, very acutely. We look at how do we best protect ourselves in short, medium, and long term from this risk. But the geopolitical situation we cannot control. So there's always a worry point that something comes up that is so impactful where it would have a lot of influence on the threats and therefore on the risk picture. In particular, I am concerned about AI, and I can imagine that we will get into the AI topic when it comes to cyber a little bit later as well. But there's specific risk that AI presents. One is just an increase of conventional attacks in cyber. There's more of it, and these get better. And if you look at, phishing emails, they are now constructed very differently, and it's hard to
higher quality, lower cost, higher volume, right? Go quicker, right? Reducing the bar.
Exactly, James. That's it. And so also, I think the next step in the intensifying of this cyber war to some degree will be new attack vectors that we've not yet seen as much in cyber, but I think it is a matter of time that there is new attack vectors that AI will get into. So I'm concerned about that. Now, it's good to be concerned about all of these things, but what we're doing to protect ourselves is a lot. So we have lots of short-term proactive actions that we do, medium-term, long-term actions to make sure that we keep up with the shifting threats in the cyber environment.
It's interesting, Manfred. I'd love your take on this. And it's mean because it's almost an unanswerable question, but the little bits that you can give towards an answer, I think, are still so helpful to people. I've been talking to a lot of CISOs about living in tame periods of technology versus wild periods of technology, right? We have these periods of time where technology is fairly predictable. We're using it, we're deploying it. Of course, tame doesn't mean easy. I could argue a lot of the cloud migration was quite tame after a while. We understood it. We knew what to do. The work was still hard. And then you have wild patches where I don't think any of us with a crystal ball, can say where this AI stuff is going in the next 3, 4, 5 years. We might take some good guesses, but I don't think any of us could be that certain. How do you think about prioritizing, getting ready for these types of technology trends when it's more of a wild period, you don't know what's going to happen next? Are there any things that you lean back on as a CIO? Have the best people with enough capacity working ahead, or, starting research projects or talking to analysts? What's your way of keeping on the pulse in more uncertain times?
One big part is constant communication, and with people who look at that a lot as well. So You mentioned that we've got a specific risk profile at NATO, and that's certainly the case, but we're not the only ones, right? I work very closely with national governments and with my counterparts there. And there is some of the problem areas are very much comparable. And so there's a lot of information exchange that we do there, but also from the technical side, lots of learnings that come from industry conferences, from talking to organizations, from SANS, from lots of other places as well. So it is mostly a learning challenge that we make sure that we keep our level of knowledge fresh when it comes to AI, when it comes to quantum, which is another big area that we spend quite a bit of time with thinking about it. As well as data exploitation and data analysis that kind of feed into the AI track. So the short answer to this long question, which I have already lost the opportunity to give the short answer, but it's constant communication and learning from each other and comparing notes.
I'll try to keep this follow-up question short and simple. You're in charge of digital transformation, you're in charge of security, and you've got all these new technologies flying at you. In general, are you more optimistic or pessimistic about the impact of all of this on our security? Will you be able to make this a net benefit for NATO and for the world? Or is there more risk than opportunity here?
No, totally optimistic. And it will be a net benefit for NATO, but it doesn't happen by itself. It needs to be managed, including what I call the dark sides of AI, right? As I mentioned earlier, we've not yet seen different attack methods that are coming through AI, but we will see them going forward, I'm sure. So we're preparing ourselves for the shifting landscape that comes through AI, same as with quantum. So I'm very optimistic. The glass is half full, but it needs to be managed, and we need to prepare ourselves for it.
I like it. We like a bit of optimism because, it's so easy to get cynical in cybersecurity.
We don't get much.
No, we don't. So it's wonderful to have someone optimistic and in such a prominent role as well. But perhaps that's for all of your secret skills in this next topic I'll bring up. You've kind of got the inside track on all this stuff. Look, how does an organization like NATO handle digital transformation? I mean, harnessing new tech in an organization of any scale is hard, period. Particularly if there's multiple platforms and technology to be coalesced or loads of dated stuff, maybe a mainframe sitting in a corner somewhere. But an organization like yours, it's, I would think, extra challenging. And how do you do that effectively, but also do it securely? We've had plenty of digital transformation across the world over the years, but quite a lot of it has been done not very securely, kind of leaning forwards into change without much regard for security. It's something I'm sure NATO couldn't afford. So any pro tips in this kind of digital transformation and doing it securely you might offer our listeners?
So let me first talk more about the digital transformation itself that we're doing at NATO. So very much like any large organization, we started out with a fundamental rethinking of what we need to do our business differently. And our business is deterrence and defense of the Euro-Atlantic area. And one of also the corner pieces of that is that we have better situational awareness, that we have the capability to integrate our systems. And right now, if you look at the 5 military domains, those are air, land, sea, space, and cyber. There is a relative division of systems within these domains. And for us, a fundamental part of the business is to do multi-domain operations, to be able to put data together and enable a commander to have full situational awareness in the situation that the commander needs it. So it's a searching of how do you transform your business, like what many organizations do. And in our case, it is that business of deterrence and defense. Also, consultation is a big part of that. A lot of people talk about Article 5 in the Washington Treaty, our founding treaty, but Article 4 is the consultation part where allies are talking to each other constantly to affect and process the security in the alliance territory. So Article 4 is for us the guiding article to make sure that from a technology perspective, we have the capabilities in place that allow people to talk and to talk securely and to exchange information within NATO. So lots of systems implications that come with Article 4 for us as well. And so first we sat down, came up with a vision, nations as well as the NATO enterprise with a vision of how do we want to do it. Then the next step was a gap analysis. It's like, okay, so what do we need in order to get where we want to go with this vision? And then what followed was a digital transformation implementation strategy that has it broken down into strategic objectives, line of efforts. How do we get there? And then we've broken that down into an action plan that says who does what by when. What is the project? Who's responsible? What's the date? Is there any deconfliction that needs to happen? Because you can't do everything at once. It needs to be sequenced the right way. And so we've spent a lot of time on that, and we have a very solid plan in place that we're executing towards. Now, the part of your question that talked about security, that's a very interesting thing because it needs to be baked in all the way. We very often talk about security by design. It needs to come in earlier. It needs to come in the requirements stage of a project, or even when you have the first idea of a system or a change to a system, that is when security starts. And that's where we've made a lot of progress over the past years in having security at the forefront of the thinking as we design capabilities or want to make changes to existing capabilities or services. So security by design is one of the major answers to the problem.
Excellent and completely asinine comment from me, but I think it's really important to pick up on one of the things you said. Everybody stumbles or moves straight to Article 5. The preceding 4 clauses of the Washington Treaty, particularly the 4th clause, are hugely important in this. And actually, in its own way, brings us to cyber defense, James, which I know you want to get on to.
I do indeed. And I'm also just chuckling away at the prospect of our show editor working on the notes and having to reference all of the aforementioned. It's going to be great fun. Hey, Manfred, following on from that, cyber defense, does it feel different in the context of a military environment? You've been in other organizations and now, of course, NATO, which is quite a unique operating environment. But apart from anything else, you'll have a lot of people alongside you who know about and have access to military capabilities, including cyber capabilities. How different do you think it is? How does NATO think about cyber, or is it just like another large organization?
It is different. So my office is an integrated organization, as we call it, and that is civilian and military personnel. So we have both. Cyber defense has some different aspects to it because cyber, as I mentioned earlier, is a military domain of operations. So we do have cyber as a part of the military that's a transversal domain because it really affects air, land, and sea, as well as space. So that in itself is what makes cyber different. Also, the systems that we use are military as well as civilian systems. So there's really no difference with that. And all of this needs to be taken into account. And so we have a very, very close relationship with ACO, Allied Command Operations, which is, as the name suggests, the operational part of the military that also has a very large cyber group to make sure that the Supreme Allied Commander Europe, SECURE, when he needs to, has full access to the cyber capabilities of NATO. So it is different. There is a lot of advantages that come with this civil-military integration. Lots of learnings from the military. So one thing coming in from the outside, coming in from the private industry is there is a rigor of planning that the military has and a method of planning that is really quite remarkable. So the military doesn't like to leave anything to chance. And that is noticeable when we work on, let's say, a defensive cyberspace operation campaign together with the military. The level of thinking things through and coming up with what if is really quite remarkable and very inspiring. I found that. So the idea in the civil-military cooperation is to integrate advantages that come from both sides, from the military as well as from the civilian side.
Brilliant. So much to follow up then. I'm going to have to be quick and disciplined. The 32 national capabilities of the NATO members, how does it work with them? Very different in sizes and so on, but those different organizations that do cyber defense in the 32 countries.
How does it work with them? Lots and lots of capabilities that are out there at the national level. A lot of interaction with nations, because one thing that we haven't talked about with cyber is also the importance of critical infrastructure and the protection of critical infrastructure that can be very much a hindrance if there is a crisis or a conflict to the goals of the commander. And we've seen that when Russia went into the Ukraine in 2022, there was, even prior to the invasion, there was lots of cyber activity targeting critical infrastructure. So that whole part is also very, very important. One thing that we are creating at NATO is the NATO Integrated Cyber Defense Center, the NIC. And that is a place where the technical, the military, and the political part of NATO comes together, of the NATO enterprise, but also allies. And so now we have a network where we talk very frequently to allies, to my counterparts in cyber commands in various allied nations. But the NIC, the Integrated Cyber Defense Center, will give us a platform to formalize this a bit better and have people physically present for longer periods of time. Also, coincidentally, industry as well as academia will be part of the center, and we want to integrate all of that into a more holistic picture. But lots and lots of interaction between NATO enterprise and nations on the military, political, and the technical sides.
I've got one thing I want to backtrack to a little bit, and then we'll move on to new topics, I promise. But I've got too long a list of questions for you, Manfred. You have to come back for part 2 and 3. I wanted to double back a little bit to the cyber and tech threat trends and how it's changing. You made some really interesting comments there on AI and how it's adjusting behaviors of attackers. This must be a fascinating conversation at NATO. I mean, we're often struck on the show, by the way, there's this delicate balance between the old and the new coming up in our discussions. How vendor marketing and the news kind of leans us towards how AI is exacerbating security threats and how quantum is going to change everything. And, the rise of the Terminators, which I think we've established the date for in a different episode. But on the other hand, we're still struck, even in national security organizations, about just how many of the incidents we're dealing with are techniques and capabilities and vulnerabilities that have been around for years. Just old, boring stuff that's still effective. So before we move on to other topics, I'm curious, how do you at NATO see it? How do you think about the balance of the oldie but goodie for attackers versus these new areas? And how do you think about balancing your kind of mental capacity across the old but effective and the brave new frontiers? Any pro tips for our CISOs struggling with that?
Both needs to be very tightly embraced. The new and the upcoming, as well as the what I would call bread and butter, the tried and true perimeter protection, making sure that your patches are there. I mean, those are the non-glamorous parts that absolutely need to be there. And if you look at the literature and the kind of big cyber events that happened recently, just thinking back of the $1.5 billion theft, right, of cryptocurrency, it's very basic, relatively simple things that go back to vulnerabilities in software, things that are not patched, network devices, password theft. I mean, all of these things that they're still there. And that is a huge part that where companies are exposed if you don't look after that. So you need to look after that as well as thinking about quantum and AI and all of these forward-looking things.
Right. Been hopelessly indisciplined with time, James, as we expected. Sorry, Manfred.
Sorry.
I have a couple of quick questions I must ask you.
Mm-hmm.
Let's go back to the Article 5 discussion. And I won't reprise it all. There's been so much talk about war, cyber war. What does that discussion mean in NATO in terms of whether a cyber incident could trigger Article 5? Do you have a view on cyber war? Is it a real thing? Is it separate from the obvious, the wider challenge about how tech changes warfare anyway with things like drones? What does cyber war mean to you, if anything?
So definitely NATO, as its right to respond to an attack, a cyber event could trigger Article 5, and then it is up to NATO how it responds. And that is really for the North Atlantic Council to decide when a situation occurs. So it's a real thing. It's something that we think about and have that in our minds. So I think the cyber war automatically makes us think of an Article 5 situation, but there's activity that is happening and that is all below an Article 5 situation. So it's a contested environment and it is under constant activity, constant attacks that are happening on the cyber side. And so I'm worrying more about how do we best protect ourselves proactively in the short, medium, and long term. But, it's an interesting discussion that if something were to happen that's really, really bad, how would NATO respond? And the answer to that is in a method of its choosing.
Yeah. So really clear answer. It could trigger Article 5, but what you're really worried about is all the harm that's happening anyway. I think that's what I heard, and that's a really strong and clear answer, I think.
Yes, and how to protect ourselves from that harm, right?
And just finally from me, I've got to ask this. I'm sure you get this all the time, you and your colleagues, but the world is in a state of real turbulence right now. There have been all sorts of strains in the alliance and discussions about the future of the Western Alliance. So what's the mood in NATO HQ like, and how do you and your colleagues see the future of the alliance in these very tumultuous times?
I see the future as very positive. And I think we established earlier that I'm an optimist.
Yeah, we absolutely did.
That the glass is half full with
Yeah.
AI and all those new technologies. But look, I think NATO has a role to play, a very important role. And I think that NATO is contributing a lot to every member nation that we have. And there's a lot of value that NATO has provided over time. So I'm pretty optimistic as to the future of NATO. I think the world needs NATO. And I think you also see a lot of activity now with allies increasing defense spending and working towards a safer and more protected alliance. So very optimistic.
Wow. Nice.
I love some optimism. That's a wonderful place to be. Well, look, definitely finally from me. Last question. Okay, well, then there's a half question. So 1.5 questions. But if you will be so interesting, you asked for it. So look, away from geopolitics, back to technology and cybersecurity, what would you like to see to improve in the sector? You've been in this business a long time. You've been in different sectors, different continents. What are we getting right in cybersecurity, and what would you like to see change? If you have a magic wand and you could attack one thing, what would it be?
So what we're getting right is there's a lot of technical advancements that we do in cybersecurity. And just this is now really an industry perspective, not necessarily a NATO perspective. But I think the level of technology sophistication that is in cybersecurity is remarkable. The things that have happened in the last years. And if you look at the very, very first network monitoring software and log analysis and how that has now progressed into more advanced correlation of events that are happening in your network in cyberspace, in addition to lots and lots of other things, that's very commendable. What needs to happen more is the communication and the exchange of information. I think we've got a huge opportunity to learn from each other even more. And it's happening to some degree. There are organizations out there that bring people together and that facilitate this exchange of information. But I wish there was more focus with governments as well on a more standardized exchange of learnings and information in the cyber world.
That's a really good one. Look, I mean, cyber criminals are surprisingly good at sharing practices, building tools. There's a whole market and innovation occurring. So reminding us in cybersecurity across public and private sector to share what works, to share data of what criminals are up to, share practices, and trying to do that more systematically and openly, I think is a wonderful thing to put on the bucket list for change for the industry. It makes a lot of sense.
Yes.
Well, look, we've covered so much, Manfred, but we have to, Ciaran, I know we've got to bring things to a close. I know you've got 17 more questions.
I know, but I won't ask them. But you are forgetting one thing.
Ah, yes, my favorite bit, the 0.5 question. Well, look, Manfred, as you know, it's only fair if we ask that, people are listening to this podcast, we give them something useful at the end.
So we are asking you for
your 30-second takeaway. And it can be close to 30 seconds, so we won't cut the mic at that exact moment. But look, ultimately, this podcast is about lessons for cybersecurity leaders. We want them to take away something actionable, something they should do, something they should not do, something they should look at more closely. So if you had just 30 seconds with a cybersecurity leader, what would you advise them? So get yourself ready. And when you've had a moment to think, launch into your 30 seconds of infinite wisdom.
All right. I'm going to launch into it right now. So it's great to embrace the new technologies, whether it's AI, quantum. It's great to think about how do you transition to zero trust architecture. That's all good. But do not forget people. Do not forget. Earlier, I called it the bread and butter of cyber. There's some basic cyber hygiene things that still need to take place. And there's lots of vulnerabilities and activity that is targeting these vulnerabilities. So don't forget about that. Make sure that basic cyber hygiene is followed, create awareness, and educate people.
A tour de force, Manfred, all the way from the Russians and quantum computing to the bread and butter of hygiene and looking after people, consensus building, everything. There's so much there.
Quantum butter. We didn't get to quantum butter.
James always wants a new concept for his t-shirts and songs. and we have it there. That was exceptional. Thank you so much, Manfred.
Well, thank you. It was a great conversation, Ciaran and James. Wonderful to talk to you. And we should all, when it comes to cyber hygiene, let's all stay clean and fight the good fight of cyber.
I like it. And let's have you back for some more wisdom soon when we can ask you about how some of these things have developed. You've been a fantastic guest there, Manfred.
Thank you.
So, Ciaran, I guess that's it for today.
Apart from feedback.
Yes, the standard feedback. I say standard like we don't care. Of course, it's hugely important to picking the guests that matter, the topics that are keeping you awake at night. So we actually really do want it, please.
And some of the feedback we get is anything but standard. I will leave that there. You can leave us feedback at the podcast site, or you can email us at cyberleaderspodcast@sans.org. Tell us anything you want.
I like it. And with that, thank you very much for listening, everyone.
Yes, thank you for listening, and keep cybering. So from me, Ciaran Martin.
And me, James Line.
It's goodbye.
And ta-da for now.